I'm a forensic nurse at Meridian General Hospital in Burlington, Vermont, or at least I was, until I submitted my resignation 4 months ago. You can call me Dr. Isabella Blackwood if you want, though most people in the emergency department just called me the evidence nurse. During my 18 years there, I've seen everything you can imagine in forensic nursing: sexual assaults, domestic violence cases, homicides, suspicious deaths, and every kind of trauma the human body can endure. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about death, consciousness, and the very boundaries between life and death, and ultimately led me to leave the profession entirely. Meridian General Hospital is a Level I trauma center serving northern Vermont and the Canadian border region. It's a comprehensive medical facility with a specialized forensic nursing unit that handles some of the most complex criminal cases in New England. During my time there, I consulted on thousands of violent crime cases, worked with homicide detectives, documented evidence for court proceedings, and served as an expert witness in cases where the precise nature and timing of injuries could determine the difference between manslaughter and first-degree murder charges. The case I'm about to tell you about began long before the victim arrived at our hospital. It started on a bitter cold Tuesday morning, January 15, 2019, in the small mountain town of Stowe, Vermont, about 25 miles northeast of Burlington. The victim was Aurelia Sinclair, a 31-year-old environmental scientist who worked for the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. She was a brilliant researcher, specializing in water quality assessment, had recently completed her PhD in environmental chemistry from the University of Vermont, and was considered one of the state's leading experts on pollution monitoring in alpine watersheds. Aurelia lived alone in a converted farmhouse on Hollowbrook Road, a remote property she had purchased 2 years earlier, specifically because of its proximity to the pristine mountain streams she studied for her research. She was an experienced outdoors woman, an expert cross-country skier, and someone who understood the dangers of Vermont winters better than most people. Her colleagues at the Department of Environmental Conservation described her as methodical, safety-conscious, and never one to take unnecessary risks in her field work. On that January morning, Aurelia was conducting routine water sampling at Cascade Creek, a remote mountain stream accessible only by a steep hiking trail that required snowshoes during winter months. She had made this same journey dozens of times over the past 2 years, always following proper safety protocols, informing her supervisor of her exact location and expected return time, carrying emergency communication equipment, and wearing appropriate cold weather gear for the sub-zero temperatures that are common in Vermont mountains during January. At approximately 10:30 a.m., while collecting water samples from a measurement station located near a frozen waterfall, Aurelia stepped onto what appeared to be solid snow-covered ground. What she didn't realize was that recent temperature fluctuations had created a thin ice shell covering a deep ravine that had been carved out by spring melt runoff. The ice gave way beneath her weight, and Aurelia fell 43 feet into the rocky ravine below, landing on a mixture of jagged granite boulders and frozen debris. The fall caused catastrophic injuries. Aurelia struck her head on multiple rock surfaces during the descent, suffered a severe spinal fracture at the C4 vertebra, broke both legs in several places, and sustained massive internal injuries from impact with the sharp granite formations at the bottom of the ravine. Most critically, she was now trapped in a location where the January temperature was nearly 15 degrees below zero, with no possibility of climbing out, and no way for anyone to hear calls for help. What made Aurelia's situation even more dire was that the ravine was essentially a natural ice cave. During winter months, cold air settled into the depression and was trapped there, creating conditions that were significantly colder than the already brutal ambient temperature. Additionally, Aurelia's heavy winter clothing had been torn during the fall, and she was lying partially submerged in a small stream that continued to flow despite the freezing conditions. Aurelia's supervisor, Dr. Margaret Thornfield, became concerned when Aurelia failed to check in at her scheduled 2 p.m. contact time. Following department protocol, Dr. Thornfield immediately contacted the Vermont State Police and organized a search and rescue operation. However, finding someone in the vast wilderness of the Green Mountains during a Vermont winter is extremely challenging, even when you know their approximate location. The search team, led by Vermont State Trooper Lieutenant David Hartwell, began their operation at 4:30 p.m. as daylight was already beginning to fade. They followed Aurelia's snowshoe tracks for nearly 2 miles through dense forest before losing the trail in an area where recent snowfall had obscured the evidence of her passage. The search continued through the night, using thermal imaging equipment and search dogs, but the extreme cold and challenging terrain made the operation both dangerous and largely ineffective. It wasn't until 11:15 a.m. the following day, Wednesday, January 16th, that search and rescue volunteer Hannah Morrison heard faint sounds coming from what appeared to be solid snow-covered ground. When the rescue team investigated, they discovered the hidden ravine and found Aurelia 43 feet below, unconscious and showing no signs of life. The technical rescue operation to extract Aurelia from the ravine took nearly 3 hours. Rescue personnel had to rappel into the narrow space, secure Aurelia to a specialized rescue litter, and use a complex rope and pulley system to lift her to ground level. During this entire process, none of the rescue team members could detect a pulse, spontaneous breathing, or any other signs of life. When Aurelia was finally brought to the surface at 2:47 p.m. on January 16th, she had been in the sub-zero ravine for over 28 hours. Her core body temperature, when measured by the paramedics, was 68 degrees Fahrenheit, a level of hypothermia that is almost always fatal. Her skin was blue-gray in color, her pupils were fixed and dilated, and she showed all the clinical signs of death, from severe hypothermia and traumatic injuries. Paramedic supervisor Rachel Donovan made the decision to begin aggressive warming and resuscitation protocols, despite Aurelia's apparent death. This decision was based on the medical principle that hypothermia victims are not dead until they're warm and dead, meaning that the extreme cold might have preserved some cellular function, even in the absence of detectable vital signs. The transport to Meridian General Hospital took 45 minutes, during which the paramedic team provided continuous CPR, active external warming, and artificial ventilation. Throughout this entire transport, Aurelia remained clinically dead, with no detectable heartbeat, no spontaneous breathing, and no neurological responses to stimulation. When Aurelia arrived at our emergency department at 3:32 p.m., the trauma team was prepared for what we call a cold water drowning protocol, even though this was technically a hypothermia and trauma case. Dr. Christopher Vale, our chief emergency physician, had seen a few cases of extreme hypothermia during his career, but nothing quite like Aurelia's combination of traumatic injuries and prolonged exposure to life-threatening cold. The medical team immediately began aggressive rewarming using heated IV fluids, warm humidified oxygen, and external warming devices. They also initiated continuous cardiac monitoring and prepared for the possibility of using extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, ECMO, if Aurelia's heart showed any signs of electrical activity as her body temperature increased. From a forensic nursing perspective, I was called to the trauma bay, not because anyone expected Aurelia to survive, but because we needed to document her injuries for several potential legal proceedings. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration would likely investigate whether proper safety protocols had been followed by the Department of Environmental Conservation. There might be questions about whether the rescue operation had been conducted appropriately, and if Aurelia died, there would be a coroner's investigation to officially determine the cause and manner of death. As I began my initial assessment and documentation, I found injuries consistent with a high-impact fall onto irregular surfaces. Aurelia had suffered a severe traumatic brain injury with obvious skull fractures visible on CT imaging. Her cervical spine showed a complete fracture dislocation at the C4 level, which would typically result in immediate paralysis and potentially fatal disruption of the nerve pathways that control breathing and heart function. She had sustained multiple rib fractures, a punctured lung, massive internal bleeding from liver and spleen lacerations, and compound fractures of both femurs. Any one of these injuries could have been fatal. Combined with 28 hours of exposure to life-threatening cold, Aurelia's survival seemed medically impossible. Dr. Vale and the trauma team worked on Aurelia for over 2 hours, gradually raising her core temperature while monitoring for any signs of cardiac activity. As her body warmed, the medical team was able to detect occasional irregular heartbeats on the cardiac monitor, but these were weak, inconsistent, and insufficient to maintain blood circulation. At 5:47 p.m., after Aurelia's core temperature had been raised to 89 degrees Fahrenheit, and she had been without meaningful vital signs for over 31 hours, Dr. Vale made the decision to discontinue active resuscitation efforts. The combination of her traumatic injuries, the length of time she had been clinically dead, and the severity of her hypothermia made further medical intervention futile. I completed my forensic documentation as the medical team prepared Aurelia's body for transfer to the hospital morgue. Her case was tragic, but not unusual from a forensic perspective, an accidental death due to environmental exposure and traumatic injuries. I had documented similar cases throughout my career, and while each one was heartbreaking for the families involved, they followed predictable patterns of injury, medical response, and legal investigation. Aurelia's family was notified of her death at 6:15 p.m. Her parents, Dr. James and Dr. Patricia Sinclair, both retired college professors, drove up from Boston to make arrangements and begin the difficult process of dealing with their daughter's unexpected death. Her younger sister, Celeste, a graduate student at Harvard Medical School, accompanied them to provide support during what was obviously going to be one of the most difficult experiences of their lives. The family requested that Aurelia's body remain at Meridian General Hospital overnight, rather than being immediately transferred to the state medical examiner's office. This is not an unusual request. Families often need time to process the sudden loss of a loved one and make decisions about funeral arrangements, especially in cases of accidental death involving young, healthy individuals. What I didn't know at the time was that Aurelia Sinclair's story was far from over. As I completed my paperwork and prepared to go home that evening, I assumed that my involvement in her case was finished. I expected that within a few days, I would receive a call from the medical examiner's office requesting copies of my forensic documentation for their official death investigation, and that would be the end of my professional connection to Aurelia's tragic accident. But at 3:17 a.m., on Thursday, January 17th, I received a phone call from Dr. Vale that would fundamentally change everything I thought I knew about death, consciousness, and the boundaries of human survival. That call would set in motion a series of events that would not only challenge my understanding of forensic science and medicine, but would ultimately lead me to question whether everything I had learned during my 18-year career was based on incomplete or fundamentally flawed assumptions about the nature of life itself. As I drove through the pre-dawn darkness back to Meridian General Hospital that morning, I was convinced that there had been some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. What Dr. Vale had told me on the phone seemed medically impossible. That I was about to discover that impossibility, at least in Aurelia Sinclair's case, was apparently just another word for something that medical science couldn't yet explain. The phone call that changed everything came at 3:17 a.m. on Thursday, January 17th. Dr. Christopher Vale's voice was tight with a mixture of excitement and disbelief that I had never heard from him in all our years working together. "Isabella, you need to get down here immediately," he said, his words coming in rapid bursts. "It's Aurelia Sinclair. She's alive, and she's talking." I was certain I had misheard him. After 31 hours, without meaningful vital signs, after being declared dead at 5:47 p.m. the previous evening, Aurelia couldn't simply be alive and talking. It was medically impossible. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" I asked, fully expecting him to clarify that there had been some kind of administrative error, or that he was calling about a different patient. "Aurelia Sinclair is awake, alert, and speaking in complete sentences. She's been conscious for the past 2 hours, and asking for her family." "Isabella, this shouldn't be happening, but it is." I hung up the phone and drove to Meridian General Hospital through the dark Vermont morning, convinced there had been some catastrophic mistake in patient identification or medical records. Perhaps another young woman had been brought in, and there had been confusion about identities. Maybe Aurelia's body had been moved and someone else had awakened in the morgue area. Any explanation seemed more plausible than a woman who had been dead for nearly 10 hours, suddenly returning to consciousness. When I arrived at the hospital, at 3:52 a.m., I encountered a scene that challenged every principle of forensic science and medicine I had learned during my 18-year career. Aurelia Sinclair was sitting upright in a hospital bed, fully alert and engaged in animated conversation with the night nursing supervisor, Rebecca Martinez. Her eyes were bright, focused, and tracking people around the room with obvious intelligence and recognition. When she saw me approach her bedside, she looked directly at me and said, "Are you Dr. Blackwood? Rebecca was telling me that you're the forensic nurse who documented my case yesterday. I understand I was in some kind of accident." I stood there speechless for several moments, trying to process what I was witnessing. This was not the same woman I had examined and pronounced dead less than 10 hours earlier. The Aurelia I had documented was a severely traumatized victim of hypothermia and multiple traumatic injuries, clinically dead, with no possibility of recovery. This Aurelia was alert, articulate, and completely aware of her surroundings. "Aurelia," I said slowly, pulling up a chair beside her bed, "do you know where you are?" "I'm in Meridian General Hospital," she replied without hesitation. Rebecca explained that I had some kind of accident while doing water sampling research, and that I've been unconscious for a while. "I feel remarkably well considering I apparently had a serious injury." I looked at Rebecca, who was staring at Aurelia with tears in her eyes. She had been the night supervisor for 12 years, and had seen every kind of medical situation imaginable, but nothing had prepared her for watching a dead patient wake up and begin having normal conversations. "Aurelia, do you remember what happened to you? Do you remember the accident?" I asked. Her expression became thoughtful and slightly puzzled. "I remember being at Cascade Creek, collecting water samples for my research project. I remember it being extremely cold, even colder than usual for January. But after that, everything is very hazy. I have vague memories of feeling incredibly tired and cold, like I was sleeping very deeply for a long time." Over the next several hours, I conducted what would become the most extraordinary and medically inexplicable examination of my entire career. Despite the extensive traumatic injuries I had documented the previous day, Aurelia's cognitive function appeared to be completely normal. She could perform complex mental calculations, recall detailed information from her environmental research, and discuss technical aspects of water quality analysis that required sophisticated understanding of chemistry and biology. Her speech was clear and grammatically perfect. Her responses were appropriate and contextual. Her memory for events prior to the accident was excellent, though she seemed to have no clear recollection of the 28 hours she had spent in the ravine, or the medical procedures that had been performed on her. Most incredibly, her personality appeared to be entirely unchanged from what her family and colleagues had described. She was making intelligent observations about her condition, asking specific questions about her research projects, and expressing concern about whether her accident would impact her work schedule. But there were significant physical reminders of the severity of her original injuries. According to the CT scans and X-rays from the previous day, Aurelia should have been completely paralyzed from the neck down due to her C4 spinal fracture. She should have had multiple broken bones, internal organ damage, and severe neurological impairment from her traumatic brain injury. Yet when I examined her, she had full sensation and movement in all her extremities. Her reflexes were normal, She showed no signs of the paralysis that should have resulted from her spinal injury, and she demonstrated no cognitive deficits that would be expected after such severe head trauma. I immediately called in every specialist available at Meridian General Hospital. Over the course of that morning, Aurelia was examined by neurologists, neurosurgeons, trauma surgeons, and radiologists. Each one was as baffled as I was by her apparent complete recovery from injuries that should have been permanently disabling or fatal. We ordered immediate repeat imaging studies to compare with the scans from the previous day. The results were just as puzzling as Aurelia's behavior. Her new CT scans and MRIs showed completely normal brain structure with no evidence of the traumatic injury that had been clearly visible 24 hours earlier. Her spinal X-rays showed a perfectly intact cervical spine, with no sign of the fracture dislocation that should have left her permanently paralyzed. Her blood work showed normal values across all parameters, with no indication of the severe hypothermia, shock, or organ failure that had been documented during her initial treatment. It was as if her body had somehow healed itself completely during the hours she had been clinically dead. Dr. Vale was particularly disturbed by Aurelia's apparent recovery because he had personally pronounced her death and had been present throughout the failed resuscitation attempts. Isabella, I've been practicing emergency medicine for 23 years. I know what death looks like. Aurelia Sinclair was dead by every medical definition we use. No heartbeat for over 30 hours, no brain activity, no response to any stimulation. Dead people don't wake up and start asking about their research projects. Aurelia spent that entire Thursday talking almost continuously. She spoke with family members who rushed back to the hospital from Boston, convinced that there had been some administrative error and that their daughter hadn't actually died. She talked to colleagues from the Department of Environmental Conservation, who were called to verify that this was really Aurelia, and that her personality and technical knowledge were intact. She asked detailed questions about what had happened during her unconsciousness, how long she had been in the hospital, and whether her accident would be reported to her supervisors as a workplace safety incident. The conversation that affected me most deeply was when Aurelia began asking about the timeline of her accident and recovery. Her sister Celeste had been hesitant to explain exactly how severe her condition had been, but Aurelia was persistent in her questions. Celeste, I feel like I've been asleep for much longer than just a day or two. The last clear thing I remember is Tuesday morning, and everyone keeps saying it's Thursday. What exactly happened to me during that time? Celeste looked at me, then back at her sister. Aurelia, you were very seriously injured. The doctors weren't sure if you were going to recover. How seriously injured, and why do I feel like I've been unconscious for much longer than 2 days? Dr. Vale decided that Aurelia deserved to know the truth about her condition. He sat down beside her bed and explained as gently as possible that she had been clinically dead for nearly 10 hours before awakening spontaneously at 1:30 a.m. Aurelia absorbed this information with remarkable composure. She was quiet for several minutes, then said, "That's medically impossible, isn't it? People don't come back from being dead for 10 hours. No. Dr. Vale replied honestly, "It's not something we see in medicine. We don't have any scientific explanation for what happened to you." As that remarkable Thursday progressed, I began to notice subtle changes in Aurelia's level of responsiveness. Her speech remained clear and appropriate, but she was asking fewer questions and seemed less interested in initiating conversations. By evening, she was still clearly conscious and responsive when directly addressed, but the animated, almost energetic quality of her communication from earlier in the day had begun to diminish. On Friday, January 18th, Aurelia was still conscious and aware, but she was speaking less frequently and seemed to tire more easily during conversations. She answered questions appropriately and recognized everyone who visited her, but she was no longer asking detailed questions about her research or expressing concern about her work responsibilities. By Saturday, Aurelia was responding primarily with yes or no answers and simple phrases rather than the complex sentences and technical discussions that had characterized her first day of consciousness. It was as if she was gradually returning to some intermediate state between full awareness and unconsciousness. On Sunday morning, January 19th, when the nursing staff tried to wake Aurelia for breakfast, she did not respond. She was breathing on her own and showed normal vital signs, but she would not open her eyes or respond to verbal or physical stimulation. Vail performed a comprehensive neurological examination and found that Aurelia had returned to a state very similar to her original condition, alive but unresponsive. Over the following weeks and months, I spent considerable time trying to understand what had happened to Aurelia Sinclair during those 3.5 days of impossible consciousness. I consulted with colleagues at major medical centers across the country, reviewed every piece of medical literature I could find on hypothermia, traumatic brain injury, and near-death experiences, and ran every conceivable test to try to explain her temporary awakening. The most logical medical explanation seemed to be related to her severe hypothermia and the gradual rewarming process her body had undergone. Perhaps the extreme cold had somehow preserved neurological function that had been damaged but not destroyed, and the careful rewarming had temporarily restored normal brain activity before the damaged areas finally succumbed to their injuries. But this theory couldn't explain why her traumatic injuries had apparently healed completely during her death, why her spinal fracture had disappeared, or why her brain imaging had returned to normal only to show damage again after she returned to unconsciousness. Other experts I consulted suggested that Aurelia's awakening might have been a form of terminal lucidity, a phenomenon sometimes seen in patients near death, where they experience a brief period of unexpected consciousness and clarity before dying. But terminal lucidity typically lasts hours, not days, and it doesn't involve complete healing of traumatic injuries. The case attracted significant attention from medical professionals and researchers studying consciousness, near-death experiences, and unexplained recoveries. Medical journals published detailed case reports about Aurelia's temporary awakening, and researchers from around the world contacted me to discuss the implications for our understanding of death, consciousness, and the possibility of recovery from conditions previously thought to be irreversible. But for all the attention, analysis, and speculation, Aurelia's 3.5 days of impossible consciousness remained fundamentally unexplained from a medical and scientific standpoint. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Aurelia's case from my perspective as a forensic nurse was what it suggested about our assumptions regarding death and consciousness. If Aurelia could wake up after being clinically dead for 10 hours and demonstrate complete cognitive function, what did that mean about our definitions of death? How many other patients had we declared dead who might have still possessed some form of consciousness or potential for recovery? Aurelia Sinclair died peacefully on March 22, 2019, 2 months after her miraculous awakening. She never regained consciousness after January 19th, but her family was able to find some comfort in knowing that they had been given the gift of 3 final days with their daughter, during which she had been fully herself aware, intelligent, and able to express her love for them. Her case fundamentally changed how I approached forensic nursing and patient care. I became much more cautious about declaring cases closed or assuming that recovery was impossible. I started questioning everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between life and death, and I began to wonder how many other impossible things I might have witnessed without recognizing them. But more than changing my professional practice, Aurelia's case affected me on a personal level in ways that I struggled to process. For months after her death, I found myself lying awake at night, thinking about the implications of what I had witnessed. If someone could return from clinical death with complete consciousness and healed injuries, what did that mean about the nature of human existence? 6 months after Aurelia's death, I submitted my resignation from Meridian General Hospital. The weight of questions I couldn't answer had begun to affect my ability to function as a forensic nurse. How could I confidently document evidence and provide expert testimony when I had witnessed something that challenged the very foundations of medical science? The case of Aurelia Sinclair will always remain the most unexplained and humbling experience of my career. It taught me that forensic science, for all its precision and sophistication, still contains profound mysteries that challenge our most basic assumptions about life, death, and human consciousness. Aurelia's 3.5 days of impossible awakening gave her family the gift of goodbye and left the medical community with questions that may never be answered. It serves as a reminder that the boundary between life and death may be far more complex and mysterious than we currently understand, and that consciousness itself remains one of the greatest unsolved puzzles in all of science.